This is Amelia from Amelia Voice, and today I'll tell you a story that will make your heart ache and your soul burn for justice. Because the day my boss smiled at me with that slow, oily grin and said, "We're moving you to the front desk. It'll be easier." I learned what it feels like to be punished for telling the truth, to be humiliated in plain sight, to taste the metallic aftershock of betrayal on my tongue while the office clapped politely like he'd bestowed a blessing. I remember the way the fluorescent lights buzzed above us like a swarm of gnats around something rotting. The way those glass walls, installed so he could brag about transparency, reflected my pale face back at me, as if the building itself had become a witness, stoic and complicit. I had worked 3 years for that man, taking the kind of notes that keep companies safe and honest, auditing payments that didn't add up, filing quiet reports that no one wanted to read because they smelled like gasoline waiting for a match. And when the numbers started going missing, when expense lines bloomed like mold after a flood, I did what every handbook says to do. I raised my hand and asked the obvious question, and then I watched my calendar empty overnight. My projects reassigned, my card access changed, until the only thing left was a hollow desk by the front doors, beneath a poster that said, "Integrity is who you are when no one is watching." You would think easy would feel like a relief, a lesser weight, a soft landing, but it felt like kneeling on broken glass, smiling at strangers while my bones remembered the pain of how I got there. And every time he walked by with his cufflinks flashing and his laughter too loud, he would slow down just enough to say, "Everything going smoothly up here?" As if he'd moved me to a spa instead of a stage where everyone could witness my undoing. It wasn't just the demotion. It was who orchestrated it, who whispered into his ear that I was rigid, combative, not a team player. And that was the betrayal that tasted the worst, because it came in the shape of someone I had once loved, someone whose toothbrush was still in my bathroom, who gave me the sort of apologies that sound like lullabies. "I just told him you were stressed. I never thought he'd take it this far." He kissed my forehead with that familiar softness and said, "You know how he is." And I stood there thinking about all the times "you know how he is" has been used to excuse men like our boss, men who never have to say sorry because they've convinced the room that the temperature changes wherever they stand. So I put on the smile. I greeted the couriers. I learned the names of every barista within a 3-block radius and handed out visitor badges like they were rosaries. And every click of the thermal printer felt like another bead between my fingers, a prayer that this was not the end of me but a tunnel with a knife blade of light somewhere up ahead. And then, in that liminal space between humiliation and habit, between the 9th coffee of the morning and the sudden hush that falls when the lobby doors open and the air shifts, they arrived. 2 people with jackets too light for the weather, faces that practiced kindness the way surgeons practice a steady hand, not smiling but not cold either, asking for me by name. "We're looking for Amelia," the woman said, sliding a card onto my desk with the quiet confidence of someone who keeps their own secrets in a locked drawer. And when my eyes flicked to the embossed letters, 3 that can change a life, 3 that can swallow an empire, I felt my breath snag. FBI. It sounded silent and loud at once, like a scream in a dream, and I met their eyes and nodded because it was not the first time I had seen those letters. It was, in truth, the reason I hadn't folded when he tried to break me. The reason I had packed my courage into a hard little box and kept it with me behind the desk, where the security camera's blind spot kissed the corner of my keyboard. You see, easy is where you can hear everything. The courier gossip, the murmur of after-hours meetings that almost weren't, the offhand jokes executives tell when they think a receptionist is just furniture with a pulse. Easy is where the janitor leaves their radio on and, curious, you linger near the doors as the night guard grumbles about cleanup on 12 because someone spilled more than coffee. Easy is where the badge reader glitches and you notice who hates to wait, whose temper flickers, whose eyes dart, whose hands shake when asked to sign out a laptop that never seems to come back. "We'd like to talk," the man said. And I wanted to laugh because talk had been weaponized against me for months. Talk about tone, talk about fit, talk about how feedback was a gift. But the kind of talk they were offering didn't smell like perfume or politics. It smelled like rain on hot concrete, sharp and real and cleansing. My boss was upstairs, muscling through a town hall designed to rub salt into my demotion, and I pictured the moment he would learn that the front desk he called easy had become a turnstile for something he couldn't outcharm or outspend. "Not here," I said, "because revenge isn't fireworks. It's alignment, precision, the geometry of making sure every domino falls in order." I asked them to wait by the planter that always drooped from overwatering. And while they scanned the lobby with eyes that saw and remembered, I turned to my computer like any other morning, as if I were sending a calendar invite or ordering a new box of badge reels, and pulled up the script I'd written weeks ago, hidden beneath a file name boring enough to make anyone yawn. The document was a map of breadcrumbs, timestamps, invoice numbers that kissed each other too closely to be coincidence, shell companies with names that tasted like ash, screenshots of messages that disappeared from my work phone but not from the backup I kept plugged in under the lip of the desk, wrapped in the polite invisibility of a cable bundle no one bothered to trace. Easy gave me the vantage point to see patterns, to gather fragments, to fold them into my pocket while he and his inner circle laughed their way through committee calls and boozy launches, secure in their belief that a front desk is where power stops to check in. Maybe it would surprise you that I didn't feel triumphant as I watched the elevators devour and spit out people who might soon be witnesses. I felt something rawer, a grief with edges, because betrayal always costs something, and the cost was not just mine. It was the junior analysts who thought they'd done something wrong when they asked a question and afterward found themselves reassigned to learning opportunities. It was the client who couldn't name the queasiness in their gut, but knew that what they were signing wasn't clean. It was the part of me that believed love could be an ally at work, that the person I went home to would never run a finger down my spine while running his mouth to the man who paid his bonus. He had been my sanctuary and became my spy, his updates to the boss packaged as concern, his silence at the crucial moments a velvet rope pulled across the door. "You're making a scene," he had hissed in the hallway, the day I said I would not recant. "You're going to hurt your future." I remember thinking, my future is not a hostage. I let the elevator doors close on his face and I went back to my desk and I waited, the way a shoreline waits for a wave it knows will come. And now, the wave had arrived, with government credentials and pens that clicked only when necessary, asking quietly for evidence, which I happened to have stocked like a pantry before a storm. "Take your time," the woman said, and I realized I wasn't shaking anymore. I gathered the flash drive from its hiding place inside a cheap branded stress ball. I emailed the encrypted folder whose password was an inside joke no one else would ever know, and while I did these things, I remembered every smirk, every casual cruelty, every time my boss placed a hand on my shoulder like he was kneading dough and said, "I just want what's best for you," which was always a lie dressed up as a kindness. There's a difference between silence and strategy. I had been quiet for months, not because they had won, but because I was collecting the moments they thought didn't matter, and I was saving them for right now. The lobby clock clicked over to 11:11, and I wished for nothing except the courage to finish what I had started. At the planter, the agents were patient as boulders. The elevator chimed, and somewhere above us, behind glass and applause, a man who believed he could demote me into invisibility kept talking, and talking and talking, unaware that the front desk, his easy exile, was about to become the place where his empire began to crack. The air in the lobby changed that day, heavy with the kind of quiet that hums before thunder, and though I smiled as I handed the agents their visitor badges and said, "Conference room 3, my pulse drummed against my ribs like a warning. They disappeared behind the mirrored doors, and I was left with the faint reflection of my own face, calm, professional, unreadable, as if I had rehearsed it all my life. Upstairs, my boss was still talking, unaware that the scaffolding of his kingdom was beginning to sway, that the numbers he'd manipulated and the lies he'd lacquered with charm had already found their way to people who didn't care about his golf outings or holiday donations. I knew the risk of what I'd done, how easily heroes can be mistaken for traitors. But the moment the elevator swallowed them, I felt something loosen inside me, something that had been strangled by fear for too long. It was like taking the first full breath after years of shallow ones. I spent the rest of the day pretending everything was normal, answering phones, greeting couriers, performing that ritual of invisibility I'd mastered. But every so often I caught sight of the agents through the glass walls upstairs, their calm expressions cutting through the chaos of his showman routine, their pens moving as he gestured with his hands, a man too sure of his own invincibility to see the trap unfolding in slow motion. That night I stayed long after everyone left, the office reduced to hums and clicks, the smell of lemon cleaner sharp in the air. My reflection in the window looked like a stranger, someone older, steadier, carved by fire. I opened my drawer and touched the remaining drive, the one that contained everything too dangerous to email, labeled with a single word: proof. The janitor passed by and nodded. I smiled back, casual, harmless. It's strange how the smallest gestures become armor. I thought of my ex, the man who'd whispered about my instability to justify my demotion, how he'd texted me that morning asking if I'd made peace with things, if maybe we could talk. The irony nearly made me laugh. Peace, as if peace could grow in soil watered with deceit. I typed a reply that said, "Let's meet tomorrow, because revenge, when done right, isn't a storm. It's a slow rising tide that drowns them when they least expect it." The next morning, the company buzzed like a hive of bees disturbed. The CEO, my boss, and a handful of executives had been called into meetings. Rumors spread like perfume, whispers of audits, of missing funds, of the FBI just doing routine checks. I watched the panic spread in the reflections of computer screens, in the hurried whispers near the coffee machine. When he finally came down, his swagger was gone, replaced by a brittle kind of politeness. "Morning," he said, voice clipped. "Quiet day?" I smiled sweetly. So far. His eyes lingered on me, trying to decode something he couldn't see. That was the thing about powerful men. They forget that silence can be strategy. He turned and left, but I caught the tremor in his hand as he swiped his badge. Later, in the afternoon, my ex appeared in the lobby, carrying the scent of expensive regret. "Amelia," he started, his voice too soft, too careful. "You look good." I wanted to laugh, but instead I stood, smoothing my blazer. "Let's talk outside." The sunlight hit like confession as we stepped onto the sidewalk. "You were right," he said, eyes darting away. "He's not who we thought." I tilted my head, studying him, the guilt etched into his face like fine cracks in glass. "We?" I asked. "Or you?" He swallowed hard. I didn't mean to tell him what I said in confidence. Didn't mean to let him use my report to ruin me. My voice stayed calm, steady, the kind of calm that scared him because he knew it wasn't mercy. "He promised me he'd handle it quietly," he whispered, as if that justified betrayal. I stepped closer, low enough that only he could hear me. "He's about to be handled, all right." His eyes widened. "What did you do?" "I did my job," I said simply. "Something neither of you ever really understood." I left him standing there with his guilt and his shallow apologies, the city swallowing him as I walked back inside. By Thursday, the FBI had requested a full cooperation from all staff. The word spread through the company like a contagion. Laptops were seized. Access was revoked. People who had ignored me for months suddenly remembered my name, asked if I knew what was going on. I just smiled and said, "I'm sure it'll all work out." But the truth was uglier and sweeter than they imagined. The records I'd preserved were the skeleton key they needed. Expense reports routed through shell firms linked to his brother-in-law's construction company. Bribes disguised as consulting fees. Even falsified charitable donations to a foundation that never existed. It was all there, neatly organized by the woman he'd thought was too emotional, too naive, too harmless to fight back. That night, I sat at my kitchen table with the last piece of evidence, the voice recording of him and my ex, the one where they discussed taking care of me. "She's sharp," my ex had said. "Then blunt her," my boss had replied. The cruelty in his tone was casual, almost bored. That was the moment I'd saved for last. I listened to it twice, just to remind myself that monsters rarely sound like monsters. They sound like people who think they can't be caught. By the time dawn cracked the sky open with pale light, I'd sent everything, the last drive, the recording, the metadata logs, to the agents. It was over, or close enough that I could taste the ending in the air, metallic and electric. I didn't go to work that day. Instead, I sat by the window with my coffee, watching the sun inch higher, wondering how long it would take for the world to realize that easy was never the same as powerless. My phone buzzed with messages. I didn't answer. One from HR asking if I'd seen the news, one from my ex begging to talk, one from an unknown number that said simply, "You're braver than you think." For the first time in months, I felt weightless. But deep inside, I knew this wasn't the end. Justice was coming, but so was the reckoning, and I had yet to decide whether I would forgive or let the ashes speak for me. Because revenge, once set in motion, doesn't stop when the villains fall. It lingers. It asks what kind of person you've become after the fire. And as I watched the sky burn with morning light, I realized I wasn't sure yet if I wanted redemption, or just silence after the storm. The call came just after noon, sharp, clinical, from an unlisted number that made my stomach tighten before I even answered. "Ms. Voice," the woman said, the same one who had stood by the drooping planter days ago, her tone carrying that steady weight that means there's news you can't ignore. "We'd like you to come in. Today, if possible." The world outside my window blurred into meaningless color. I could only hear my heartbeat and the faint hum of the refrigerator, the domestic soundtrack of someone whose life had been rearranged overnight. "Of course," I said, because there was nothing else to say. When I arrived at the glass building downtown, the security guard waved me through like he already knew who I was. In the conference room, the agents were waiting, files neatly stacked, expressions unreadable. "You did the right thing," the man said, sliding a folder toward me. Inside were photos, printed stills from surveillance footage, grainy but unmistakable. My boss, late nights, meetings with people who had no business in our offices, the kind of exchanges that glow like warning lights once you know what you're looking at. "This is enough to bring charges," he said. "But there's something else. He's naming you." My throat went dry. "What?" "He's claiming you were involved. That you helped him move funds before you turned." For a moment, I couldn't breathe. The room tilted, all air gone. "He's trying to destroy your credibility," she added gently. "It's what people like him do when cornered." I laughed then, sharp, bitter, humorless. "Of course he is. Betrayal is circular. It always comes back around." "We'll protect you," she said. "But we need you to testify." That word, testify, hung in the air like a guillotine. My life, my job, my safety, all of it would be dissected, examined, doubted. They'd call me a disgruntled employee, a bitter woman, a liar seeking revenge. They'd twist my pain into motive and my silence into guilt. "He won't stop," I whispered. "Not until I'm ruined." The agent's eyes softened. "Then let's make sure he's ruined first." That night, I sat in my apartment surrounded by the ghosts of everything I'd lost, the framed certificate from the promotion that had been stripped away, the half-empty wine glass he'd left behind on our last night together, the voicemail from my mother reminding me to be kind, no matter what. Kindness had been my undoing. I stared at the ceiling until dawn, imagining courtrooms, cameras, whispers, headlines. But beneath the fear was something harder, something that refused to die. I had already been humiliated, broken, reduced to the girl at the front desk, and I had survived. I could survive this too. The trial moved faster than anyone expected. He was too arrogant, too sure of his ability to spin a story. When the indictment came down, the building where we'd all worked went silent, like it had finally exhaled after holding its breath too long. Employees stared at their screens in disbelief. The press circled like vultures. They called him visionary, betrayed by those closest to him, a cautionary tale. They called me the whistleblower. None of them knew the half of it. When I took the stand, the courtroom smelled like cold air and ink. He sat across from me in his tailored suit, expression smooth as marble, but his eyes were knives. "Ms. Voice," his lawyer began, "isn't it true that you were demoted due to performance issues?" I smiled faintly. That's what he said, yes. And isn't it also true that you had a personal relationship with a member of management? The room shifted, a ripple of whispers. My ex sat in the back, looking like a ghost in daylight. Yes, I said. And that relationship ended when I refused to be quiet about what I found. The lawyer smirked. You expect the court to believe you uncovered millions in fraud all by yourself? No, I said evenly. He helped me. The silence that followed was electric. His smirk vanished, and for the first time I saw panic crack through his practiced composure. I did my job, I continued, voice steady. He did his too, stealing from everyone who trusted him. The prosecutor laid out the evidence like a symphony, each piece a note building toward crescendo, the fake invoices, the shell companies, the offshore accounts. When they played the recording, his voice filled the room. Then blunt her. I watched his jaw tighten, his gaze drop, and in that moment, I knew I had won something greater than the case. I had taken back the narrative. The jury's faces hardened as they listened, the disgust plain, and by the time it was over, even his lawyer looked like he wanted to be anywhere else. Afterward, when they led him away in handcuffs, he turned to me and said softly, "You'll regret this." I met his eyes. "No," I said. "You will." But the story didn't end with his conviction. The company scrambled to save face, to rebuild trust, to paint themselves as victims of his deception. They offered me my job back, in any department I wanted. I declined. I was done working for people who only remembered your worth when they feared your truth. I thought about disappearing, about taking the settlement money and vanishing somewhere quiet where no one knew my name. But as I packed up my apartment, a small white envelope slid under my door. No return address. Inside was a single sentence. They weren't just his accounts. Beneath it, a bank name I recognized all too well, one connected to a politician who had once visited our office for consulting. My pulse quickened. The web was bigger than I thought. The story wasn't over. Justice had only clipped the first thread, and as I stared at that paper, my fear turned into something sharper, colder, more dangerous. Revenge had changed me. It had given me purpose. If the fire was still burning, then maybe I was meant to be its keeper. I found the envelope like a pulse in the quiet of my kitchen, and with it, the unmistakable scent of things unfinished. Power, money, the way men in suits smooth their consciences with meeting notes and handshakes. The bank name on that scrap of paper matched a branch where I'd once handed over coffee to a senator, with a smile so practiced it had no warmth. And suddenly every corridor in my memory lit up like a runway. Faces, dates, lunches that were really transactions, the charity gala where a check had been signed and then rewritten in someone else's hand. And I realized with a cold, electric clarity that what we'd torn down was only the head of a hydra. And there were other heads, each wearing a nicer suit, each with better lawyers and cameras that flashed for the narrative they wanted the public to swallow. I could have folded the paper and sent it to the agents, done my civic duty, and then retreated into the pleasant obscurity of a new life. But something in me had been rewired by the last months. Humiliation had been the forge that made me sharper, and the taste of justice once sampled was not something I wanted to dilute with distance. So I did something reckless. I reached out to the one person who had always hated the comfortable compromises of our industry, the investigative reporter who had once been refused coffee by our PR team because she asked the wrong questions. She answered on the third ring, breathless, alive, and when I told her the bank name, she didn't laugh or doubt. She set a time and a place and told me to bring everything I had. Meeting her felt like stepping into a hurricane that promised truth. And I handed over the files and the recording and the envelope and watched her eyes light up with the sort of hunger that used to make me think reporters were dangerous for all the right reasons. We worked in the shadows, late-night calls, encrypted messages that felt like confessions, a map of accounts and donations that sketched out a constellation of influence so bright it hurt to look at. The reporter, Maya, moved faster than the system, publishing a piece that threaded our case through the bank's records and the senator's travel logs, and the world tilted. There were apologies on TV that smelled like lies, resignations that arrived with too cozy statements about personal matters, and subpoenas that reached into rooms I'd never thought to open. The man we'd toppled watched it all unravel on screens that no longer reflected his face as regal, only ragged. In private, he threatened me through lawyers and whispers and one anonymous late-night voicemail that began with the old cadence of charm and ended with a promise. "You will wish you'd stayed small." But the noise had lost its power. I had learned to fold danger into a pocket and carry on. Still, revenge is not a single act but a series of careful choices, and with each revelation released to the light, I felt the cost collecting like rent. Friends who had believed his version of kindness were peeling away. My ex, whose betrayal had been the first knife, moved back into my orbit trying to salvage what he could, claiming he'd been naive, not malicious, and I stood there. The woman who'd been demoted and then put in the path of justice, listening to him ask for forgiveness the way some people ask for favors, and I realized forgiveness is not free. It exacts a price that I wasn't yet willing to pay. The trial of the others was a spectacle that tasted of iron and victory. The senator denied everything with a practiced sorrow that the cameras ate without chewing. But bank audits and whistleblower testimony are hunger that won't be easily sated. And one by one, the names on my map began to wobble. Maya's piece had given the public a story they could not ignore, and pressure did what patience sometimes cannot. It cracked foundations. When the subpoenas reached the senator's foundation, when donors were forced to explain checks and the charity that had been a veil finally opened to daylight, I sat in the gallery and watched men who had once feigned benevolence grow small, their shoulders folding inward like pages. I had imagined that watching them fall would be a kind of coronation for me, a vindication that would sing of justice and sleight of hand unmasked. But instead, I felt something else, an exhausted emptiness. Like the quiet after an opera when the orchestra goes silent, and you realize the applause does not heal the wounds the story inflicted. There was a victory, yes, and also a reckoning. The media wanted new angles. The lawyers wanted me to sign away the last of my privacy in exchange for protection, and people who had once ignored me now wanted to speak on my behalf, as though my pain had been a convenient prop in their narrative of sympathy. I had to decide who I was beyond revenge. A whistleblower who vanished into a better life, or a woman who became a guardian for other small voices pushed aside by systems that prize image over truth. I chose the latter in a way that surprised even me. Using the settlement and the public attention, I set up a small nonprofit to help employees at companies where silence is currency. Hotlines, legal support, a fund for those who cannot afford to stand alone. It was painstaking and small, but it felt like repairing something I'd watched break for years. The ex tried to re-enter my life with scripted attentions and promises of, "We can work this out," but I kept my distance. His betrayal had been a lesson about proximity and power, and I would not let intimacy be a pathway for manipulation again. In the quiet moments, I thought of forgiveness, and some nights I believed I had extended it. Other nights, the memory of his voice plotting with my boss made forgiveness feel like surrender. In time, the headlines faded, as headlines do, and the company that had once held us all in its gilded web was a case study in ethics courses and a cautionary tale for investors. People asked if I wanted to return, if I wanted the desk, the badge, the bland security of acquaintance, and I always said no. The front desk had been a crucible, not a prison. And while it had been the place where the FBI first asked for my evidence, it was also where I learned to listen, to collect, to see. My life was different now, quieter, more deliberate, with fewer invitations to galas and more requests for panels on workplace justice. I spoke about power and silence and the way systems protect predators with polite euphemisms, and young women told me I'd given them permission to be loud, and that was a currency I could live on. Yet the story kept pulling me back. There were still names that hadn't fallen, a network whose corner I'd only grazed, and the envelope I'd found under my door had been the first breadcrumb on a path that might never end. Some nights I felt the old hunger for revenge flare up like embers when a news cycle attempted to rehabilitate a villain, or when I heard someone I trusted whisper a defense for a man who had hurt me. but the ember had cooled into a light I could carry without burning myself. A vigilance that taught me to act with precision, not spectacle. In the end, the question I could never fully answer was whether revenge had saved me or consumed me, had it lifted a weight from my chest, or carved out a place inside that would always be hollow where betrayal had lived. The honest answer was both. I had been broken and found a new architecture. I had watched men fall and built something small and stubborn in the rubble. When the last of the subpoenas landed and the last of the press left our building, I walked back into that lobby one afternoon, not to reclaim a job, but to visit a place that had once been a turning point in my life. The receptionist greeted me like an old friend, and I caught the sunlight on the badge reader and thought of the tiny, shrewd ways truth travels when someone is there to listen. Amelia Voice, me, had become more than a name in a byline or a whisper in court. I had become a story people told when they wanted courage. I smiled, not because the past was healed, but because I had learned to make something new from its ruins, to hold justice not as a weapon but as an offering, and if the world still needed a keeper of small truths, then I would be there, waiting at the easy desk where the FBI once came, now ready to answer the next knock.